This is one of the first games where I started to play Open Sicilian in serious tournaments, and um, the outcome of the game was very very pleasing for me. It turned out that in many positions you don't really need to have a lot of theoretical knowledge about the opening. You can just play some common sense moves and um, rely on the general understanding of the game. And if the variation isn't very specific and very tactical, you can still do pretty well in the game. Here black usually plays d6 to prevent the check on d6, and develops in ways similar to the Sveshnikov variation, but he has a bit more flexibility about when the knight comes out to f6. My opponent, on the other hand, tried to play a slightly different line, which is a bit more strategically risky. White has obtained the advantage of two bishops, but he's a little bit behind in development, and that's what black is basically hoping for. Here I had a choice to trade queens or to retreat somewhere with a queen, and there's a lot of possible squares for the retreat. I didn't really know which one would be better, so I just decided that it might be simpler to trade off the queens, even though it does give black an extra tempo to come out to f6 with a knight. With this move, black wants to get rid of the weakness on the d file, develop his bishop as soon as possible, and that just generally open up the position a little bit while he's ahead in development. White's moves are fairly simple and obvious in a way that I don't really have very much choice. So black managed to get rid of his weakness on the d file, of the backward pawn on the d file, but at the same time this gave white an opportunity to develop the rest of his pieces, and he's no longer behind in development. He also managed to maintain his two bishops, and that was making me fairly happy with the outcome of the opening. In practice, grandmasters have played this position a few times, and there's some ways of fighting for equality for black, but I would still prefer to play this position as white. This is a very useful move because it restricts the black knight from certain squares, and it later allows me to possibly open up the position with f2 to f4. And it's just a general useful move because this also gives me an idea of possibly transferring the bishop to g2, where it would be pretty active on the long diagonal. Move knight c8 is a little bit passive, and the transfer of the knight to e7 was probably better tied to the idea of playing something like bishop f5, trying to exchange one of white's bishops, and on c8 the knight really won't be able to do very much. So I think this helps white to increase his advantage slowly, move by move. Black was able to control the d file, which is very important in this type of positions, but because all the invasion squares such as d3 and d2 and d1 are covered by the white pieces, it doesn't really give him much benefit in this position to have the open d file. In the meantime, white is planning to play f4 soon, and maybe then the loose position of the bishop on e6 will become a factor. So after this, the king in the corner might feel a little bit insecure because all the dark squares around him are possibly covered by the white dark square bishop, and the king had to retreat to the corner, which is also not a good sign from the general endgame point of view, in the endgame you want to keep your king closer to the center. But here the black king has to retreat just to avoid the checks. At this point I wasn't really sure how I was going to play for the win here, but it just seemed to be a very useful idea to try to open up more lines, files and diagonals on the queen side where I have a passed pawn, and also where the black king is hiding. And the fact that the pawn is on a6 and the bishop is on c6, that just helps me out to open up files on that part of the board. If the pawn was on, say, a7 still, it would be a lot more difficult for me to do that. Again, just controlling the dark squares more and more, preventing the knight from coming out to b6, and also forcing the black rook to move somewhere. Black has only one active piece on the board, which is the rook on d4, so it really makes sense to trade it off. After this, the black king is completely trapped in the corner, and now more and more ideas against that king are possible. Now all of black's pieces are completely tied up. The knight doesn't really have any moves. If it goes to e7, it's going to be pinned along the e-file. The rook is tied up to defending the knight, and the bishop is covering up the d7 square against the invasion of the rook. So all of black's pieces are very, very passive. The king is completely without moves in the corner, and white basically here has a decisive sequence already. So at this point my opponent thought that he managed to defend against the immediate attack, and he may have some chance of saving the game, but he missed a very simple tactical shot that I was really happy to execute on the board. After this exchange sacrifice, white is going to inevitably give checkmate, because if the pawn takes on a6, then white goes bishop to g2, and there's no defense against the power of these two bishops. If rook e4, then bishop e4, and it's checkmate. And notice how the pawn and the bishop on c7 are nicely covering up all the dark squares, and the other bishop is coming in and delivering checkmate on the light square. So it's a very good example of how two bishops can coordinate together, and how they're especially powerful if they're supported by another piece like a rook. So in this game, my opponent really gave me all the opportunity to show the typical ideas of playing endgames with two bishops. He generally played fairly passively. I was able to cover up all the squares from the black knight, like f4, and he then had to move the knight to a passive position. And then he also allowed me to open up files and diagonals on both sides of the board after f4 and b5. And in the end, it was just a matter of being precise and winning the game with some tactical shots.